Hello, welcome. I'm Commissar Mark, and today we are going to be making a video about Season 3 map making. Since we haven't had one in a while, I figured we might as well finish this little mini-series with one about balancing and how to design a map conceptually to be as little annoying as possible, because we need to talk about balance as well as labor sponging and population goals, things of that nature. This is gonna apply to Julius as well as Augustus mode. Of course Vanilla as well, but Vanilla didn't even have editor. It's all because Bianca made Julius, and because of that we have the editor tool. So in any case, let's just go ahead and jump right into it. So conceptually, the most important thing you need to decide when making a map is not only how big the map is. I've had some people ask, how do you resize it? It's in the when you create a new map in the assignment editor, then you can click in the top left and you can select the map size you want, and that's how you get larger maps. Now not only how big the map is, but you also need to decide how many people do you want the player to fit. The other requirements are also a concern, but namely the population, because today we're going to talk about economic balance and worker balance, and so this is an important factor. For example, just to explain it, let's imagine we are playing Vanilla Tinges, right? And in Vanilla Tinges you need 8,000 population to beat the map, but it is a very big map. It has a lot of open space, a lot of possible fertile land. There are virtually no obstacles of any kind. Therefore, building the city is pretty straightforward, but there is only enough trade to sustain around 3,000 workers, and then after that the player will sit there. There is no more trade, and they would have to go patricians, but your prosperity goal is so low that you don't need patricians in Tinges. So it feels awful to have to labor sponge to be able to get the population. What is labor sponging? Labor sponging is when you create artificial jobs, either by creating extra culture rating by spamming libraries, theaters, buildings of that nature, or just straight up need to soak up labor by building like mission posts or industrial buildings to overproduce on purpose, things like that. Now, this is not only boring, but also it feels awful to do, because you are not gonna advance your city in any way building this, and you just have to do it to avoid unemployment. In Augustus, unemployment is harder to manage, therefore you have to do this more than before on maps that are poorly balanced. That's why I'm making this video, as to provide sort of an idea what to watch out for when making a map and how to judge if the player has to then do this. Because I personally, most of my maps, or virtually all of the modern ones that are made after I transitioned to Augustus, have been doing it with no need for labor sponging, because I don't like it personally as a player, and also I'm aware how frustrating it can be to people. And keep in mind that not only is this relevant to, oh, if I have 10,000 population, how many workers do I assume player can have employed with this much trade that I'm gonna add, right? That's one thing. But another thing is, even if you add enough trade to sustain 10,000 population naturally without having to labor sponge artificially, the problem is that if you did not touch the prices, the trade will very likely give the player too much money. This is a question of economy, because it creates the same problems if your money loses value in the game, because you get so much of it that you are not motivated as a player to build more industry, even though you could trade more. You just don't want to, because you have all the money you need, so why would you do it? That's a problem, because then you go back to the same solution, and oftentimes people would start labor sponging rather than doing the trade anyway, because it's easier, you don't have to think about it. So if you want to prevent people from getting bored, if you want people or players of your maps to not just get bored, but also not labor sponge and enjoy the experience and feel like they are always working towards something, then you want to balance the economy. Now, how do we balance the economy? That is a complex question, and you have multiple tools how to do it, but essentially it boils down to a couple that are the most important ones. So the first thing you can do is custom empires and select quota that's large enough to sustain this. You keep in mind that this quota can expand as player goes on, and with events you can tie it to like as he reaches certain population, or make an event that ties it to like a caravanserai or a certain monument if you want to. But you can expand the quota with events. So it might not be there at the very start, but you want to expand it so that it accommodates this larger population goal, so that players don't have to labor sponge. That's something you could do, but again, problem will persist where the prices for these goods, vanilla-wise, will result in too much profit. So you want to adjust prices. The more quota you add, usually the less profitable it needs to be, because instead of selling 15 units of pottery for 140 denarii each, you are gonna allow the player to sell 40 or 80 units, but for like 90 denarii. And therefore the profit margins are gonna be slimmer, but the quota is gonna increase, and it's gonna also require the player to manage their quota throughput better, which means building highways or setting up docks and warehouses correctly, no trader ping pong, Grand Temple to Mercury, Caravanserai, Lighthouse. All these things can then be used, and it makes it a rewarding experience for people to actually have to think about logistics as well. And so you can also do that. Now these things work together, so you can have more quota, you can also adjust prices. Now with prices, how do you judge how much is necessary? Well, it all starts with wages. I'm gonna have to explain this here. I did explain it before, but since I cannot expect everyone to watch every single one of my videos, it's probably best to cover it here as well. And so wages is in your labor advisor. This is the value here is how much you pay to 10 workers per year. And it's not to single worker, it's 10. So a single raw resource production building, workshop or a farm usually employs 10 workers. So this is how much per year you will pay to them. So normally it starts at 30. If you've done an event to increase wages that Rome pays, you can expect the player to match or exceed it. Usually exceeding by at least 4 is common, so you can account for that as well in your calculation. And not only this, but this building you, for example, would judge, let's say I want to know if I set an export for, if the player makes a clay pit and then 2 workshops for pottery, how much money is he gonna lose to naturally paying wages, and then how much can I expect to charge, he can charge for those exports to still turn a profit, but not be broken, right? Because if it's too much, then obviously the larger the quota, the easier it breaks. So let's go ahead and calculate this. Of course, this will change if you do imports, but let's say that if we run a clay pit, that clay pit itself is 10 workers, right? So it's gonna be at vanilla rate. The wages are usually starting at 30, so let's account for 30. And so therefore we know that the clay pit will cost us 30 denarii, and then the 2 workshops will cost us both 10 workers as well, so that is gonna add up to total of 90 denarii. And each workshop will produce 4.8 units of pottery per year. Clay pit is 9.6 clay, but that splits into the workshops, and so the workshops will both output together 9.6 units of pottery, which you can then sell. Let's say it's 10 units, so easier calculated. And if price for pottery is, let's say 100 denarii, then we would be able to make 1000 denarii money, but it's not profit, right? So it's just income from this. But now we need to figure out what the expenses are, because it's not just the 30 workers we need to employ. There needs to be a prefect, there needs to be an engineer, there needs to be a warehouse. There are people living in the city who are working in these industries who themselves need services. They might pay taxes, but they might not, especially early. So how do we calculate this? It's impossible to like say, oh, there's always gonna be a prefect. Yeah, likely, but it might be an order map. So instead, it is common to use logistical workers, as in for each 10, which means for like the clay pit, which employs 10 people, right? We would say that we add extra 5 workers' wages on top, just because people need to work in the warehouses, in the logistics, in the temples, and pay levy. You know, all these things account for it, so we could just ballpark it. It's not accurate, but it's pretty reasonably accurate. You can use this and still judge it relatively accurately. And so with that knowledge, we know that we need to add extra 15 workers, 5 for each of the buildings, basically. On top of what we already calculated before, which was 90 denarii before, and now it is going to be 135 denarii, and that is just wages expense. And then we would make that 1000 denarii profit, or sorry, profit income from selling that pottery. And so we would subtract this and we would find out, oh yeah, we still have like a lot of money that player is making, especially if the quota is larger. But you need to keep in mind that player needs to be able to expand, especially early on. So these things are gonna not only have to be just barely profitable, but you need significant profit margins. However, you can kind of cut into it more and more as the map plays out and progresses. You can do some price changes to reduce it. Now, what I don't recommend is quota collapse. You could change a quota with an event to say after a certain amount of years, quota for some trade good is gonna decrease. And if you do not provide an alternative, it's just gonna be great. Now I need to destroy the industry I've carefully built, and because it's worthless, and I have to labor sponge because, you know, we need those people employed, otherwise it's gonna cause problems. So if there is no alternative provided, it's gonna annoy players. So usually you would want this system to account for that. Now, it's inevitable that people will make too much money on these kind of maps. How do we solve it? Because we return back to the problem of, if there is too much money, players will not be motivated to expand into more trade, even if it's available on the map, right? And so how do we solve that? We provide ways to spend the money, even if it's a little bit inflated. For example, making stone or marble or other import goods that are not necessarily processed into products that you sell, just for consumption goods, consumer goods. We want these things to be more expensive. By doing that, we will make sure that the player has to spend some money in order to keep the city going, build some monuments. It's gonna have a release mechanism for all that money piling up. But also, we could, for example, on larger cities, it's very common to restrict taxes in some way. You are only allowed to build 2 forums or 3 forums, whatever. Or you lock the tax rate with events. You say you can only charge 5% taxes, not more. And you can lock it with the events. So tax locking is also a way to definitely restrict this, because taxes will very easily add up towards a map with a very heavy trade amount will often have taxes be the last straw that breaks the camel's back, so to speak, and it will cause the economy of the map to explode and collapse because there's too much money. Players will lose motivation to do anything, because why would they if they don't need the money? Therefore, it is very important to think of it like this. Make sort of a summary of like the income and expenses at any given point. You need to get a leeway. Now the thing is, of course, we cannot like judge it only from one person playing the map, because there are multiple kinds of players, from people who are like completely terrible at the game to people who are masters. People who are masters at the game will be able to calculate every single worker. They will go ahead and do things that you might not even know are possible, to manipulate the systems to basically break open and completely destroy a map that other people would fail at. And so you have a tremendous skill gap between the two groups, and then there are people in the middle, right? So how do you solve it? You could do 2 versions of the map, one of them lenient and one of them for veterans. That's what I do usually. Because it's impossible to make one map that's gonna be satisfactory for all people, because again, the skill gap is tremendous and you can't make a map that's gonna be beatable for these people on one end and also interesting for the veterans, because the veterans enjoy when being challenged and they don't want a map that's too easy, and this will be too easy, which for them is again gonna lose motivation to expand and build things, while for the average casual player, they will just kind of flail around and maybe do something important every now and again, but they will often take a long time to realize things, or they will not do the proper decisions in time, things of that nature. Now, also, there's another factor. The more military you have of the map, usually that also corresponds with more towers and forts player has to make, and that also adds expense because it's levy. Levy overall, again, adds to the logistics costs of every building. As we said, it's like 5 workers for each building. Usually it covers like the worst of it, but it depends on how the player is playing as well. If you have temples, small temples are, for example, a full set of 5 small temples or sorry, not full set of small temples, but if you were to cover 3000 population worship space with small temples, it will cause the player to require 960 denarii per year in levy alone. That's a lot, because small temples are not supposed to be levy efficient. There are Lararia on the other end of the spectrum, but it can take decades for them to pay off, so that's not really a solution. Large temples are a monument, therefore require, you know, architect, worker camp, resources, which can be very expensive on some maps, but they cost you half the levy per year. It's like 460, and so you can actually like save money long term if you imagine that each year you will lose you will lose only 460 instead of 920. Then obviously that's gonna play a big part in the long run if the map is tight on money. And so oracles as well as mausolea are actually even better in terms of levy efficiency, but they're also monuments. And so all these things can add up, and depending on the player builds, this could then impact how much money they have. But realize this, it's impossible to make a map which is not gonna have the economy inevitably break at some point. Each map will break at some point, unless it's poorly balanced, in which case you make the players starving all the time, which can be also very unenjoyable. You need to provide the money so that they can do these things. So inevitably each map will break its economy, but it depends when does it break. If it breaks too early, it results in it being annoying or unenjoyable for people, because then they don't have motivation to complete the map or push the population when they don't need more trade, they don't need more labor sponging, they don't want to do labor sponging. And therefore this is an important aspect of designing a map, designing its economy and designing its empire map. All these things play together into sort of a mosaic of like how the map is gonna actually play. Right? So anyway, I think I rambled long enough. Hopefully this is gonna provide some sort of insight into how to design these systems, because each map is like its own microcosm and you need to design its economy from scratch essentially. And it's very important that you do it correctly, because otherwise your maps are gonna be boring, or they are gonna be unengaging, unmotivating for people to complete. And therefore I think we don't want people to associate these emotions with you know, something that you spend so much time designing. So now that we have the new editor tools with Augustus, it can take a lot of effort to make a map. And so you should put some thought behind doing these systems as well as just doing terraining, because currently as it is, you spend around 1/3 of the time in editor doing terrain, and then like 2/3 of your time are spent in the XML files. So anyway, thank you for watching and see you around. Bye.